थोड़ी सी इसमें कुछ 4-5 बातें पहले करना चाहता हूँ कि हमें कुछ चीज़ों को we have to take stock of a few developments that are happening. And even before I say that, I think whatever we are talking about, of course, have a huge shadow of uncertainty looming over it, because we don't know what's post-COVID world would look like, whether there is going to be a post-COVID world or whether we'll have to live with COVID for a long duration of time. And even in Pakistan, lockdown is easing up, but we have seen the number of cases growing very, very rapidly. Although luckily the death rate is not as high as we have seen in some of the OECD countries. So I think there are positives and negatives. So whatever we say is bound to change as the situation evolves. But I think nevertheless, there are a few things that we need to be aware of. The first is that after, and if we talk in the larger context of Belt and Road Initiative, and of course Pakistan is a part of it. So I think going forward, countries would be needing more financing, and they would be much more open to accessing any source of finance, because for multilateral financing, there is going to be a huge competition. So if Chinese have the money to offer, first, there are going to be many takers for that. Whether they'd have it or not, I think that's another question. The second is that while countries would be very much open to get new money, they'd be hard pressed to pay back the older loans. Because even if there were any public-private partnership projects, the revenues are going to fall. The country's capacity to pay back debt is going to shrink substantially. And you know that Pakistan has already asked G20 and others to kind of restructure its debt. And I think it's the same for many other developing countries. So the investments that have already been made, I think they are likely to suffer from disruptions in cash outflows and repayments. So I think that's second. The third is that when you come to Pakistan especially, I think there is an ongoing conversation on IPPs and capacity payments. And I think that is quite central to how Pak-China policy on CPEC is going to move forward. Because the news is coming out that Pakistan has already requested China to reduce the interest rate on the existing energy projects. And it has also requested China to change the structure to kind of extend the debt repayment terms on those projects from 10 years to 20 years. I'm not sure what China's response is going to be. Probably they'd agree to some because they know that Pakistan is in a tough spot. But I think the IPP conversation, it has to be managed well, not to one of the largest sponsors in the world. So I think that's third. The fourth is, and I think Nadeem Saab and Hassan Saab and others have also kind of alluded to that, that the world as we know it is changing, and the market structure and the trade structure is going to change. And I do believe that for China, MENA region, Middle East, North Africa, will resume greater importance as import markets in US and Europe are going to shrink. And as soon as China's interest in MENA increases further, I think Pakistan's importance, both due to connectivity and its geostrategic location, the weather and everything, it's going to increase. So I think Pakistan is not going to lose its importance there. The next thing is, and again, I'm just kind of summarizing because many of our panelists have talked about it, are the opportunity sectors. And there are sectors that are going to gain, which need to inform government policy. So we do know that IT and many of its sub-segments are going to be the beneficiaries. Agriculture sector is likely to suffer less because mostly of inelastic demand. Logistics, I think, would assume greater importance. And even health-related sectors, I think, are going to be very important. You also talked about FDI. And I think we must realize that the competition to get FDI would be cutthroat going forward. Each and every country would be racing to offer incentives for any possible sources of FDI. And I think even when you look at Pakistan, I think we are going to face domestic competition. As provinces are going to face the need of investment, we would see KP, Punjab, Sindh, and even Balochistan kind of mobilizing their efforts to offer incentives to incoming investors, because the investors would be fewer and the needs would be greater. So I think that competition is going to be there. And lastly, I think the government's ability to intervene through a fiscal stimulus, through infrastructure investments, through public investments, is going to be far smaller. And if you would refer to the ongoing conversation on the 10th NFC award, on 18th Amendment, we can very clearly see that the resources are shrinking and tensions are rising. And I think the issue is going to be very, very contentious. So if we believe that federal government or even any provincial government would be able to spend significant amounts of money in infrastructure or to mobilize investments or maybe special economic zones hugely, I think that's going to be a little bit more difficult. Now, what it means for us is, in terms of a policy response, that as government's ability to put in a fiscal stimulus or to put in hard cash is going to be limited, they are going to be reliant more and more on policy reforms, on softer reforms, on interventions that do not need money. I think they would be of paramount importance. So when we talk about special economic zones, because special economic zones are not as investment intensive as, let's suppose, a railway project or something else, so I think that's not going to be a problem. But I think more than the infrastructure investments, uh, the regulatory reform is going to be important, because uh, in an environment where there is a huge competition for FDI, I think the tolerance in the investors to bear with the red tape is going to be much less. And if any province that can succeed or that is going to do a good job in improving its regulatory environment within its SEZ is probably going to be a winner, at least in relative terms compared to the other provinces. So I think SEZs and software reforms are the keywords. The other one is that government would need to get out of the traditional public investment paradigm. And I think it would really need to now rely on private sector investment, both purely private investments as well as private investment infrastructure, which means public-private partnerships. And that is something that we have talked about a lot in the past. I think Pakistan also uh, has had a track record of PPPs, but only in a few sectors like energy. I think that would need to kind of go out of that energy sector, and Pakistan and the provinces are going to need private investments in infrastructure services and in a number of other areas. And I think something that Hassan Daud Saab said, I think that was very interesting, that the tourism in KP is likely to pick up because there are not going to be international tourists, there are going to be more domestic tourists. I think that is the key, that going forward, we need to have a domestic focus as well. As the world is kind of going through a metamorphism, and the sources of financing are going to dry up, I think we need to have a domestically focused strategy. When we talk about investments, we need to mobilize domestic investors as well, because that is going to be a saving grace for Pakistan. And I think lastly, I would refer to what Nahid said about restructuring the industrial landscape of Pakistan and of different provinces. And I think we all talk about the opportunity sectors, and I just refer to them like IT and agriculture and logistics and others. But I think the real question to ask is that, are these new opportunities informing our policy response? When we talk about SEZs, are we looking at these opportunity sectors? When we look at industrial policy, are we looking at these sectors? And I think at some places we might be. So for example, when we are planning for a special economic zones, it might be easier to talk about the opportunity sectors. But when we talk about the political economy of our industrial policy, when we decide how to treat the 5 export sectors, how to kind of treat the subsidies going to the large industrialists, how to treat the sugar industry, the textile people, the cement cartel. I think those are the real contentious issues because whether we like it or not, going forward, Pakistan and for that matter, many other countries would not have much money to spare. So I think we must realize that the party that has been going on for the last 70 years is over. And the sooner we realize it, I think the better we'd be. Thank you.